Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another great evening of great decisions. I'd like to welcome you all here. As usual, I have a few announcements to get things going, and then I will be turning things over to Professor Klug, who has an incredible lecture coming up this evening. First off, I would like to thank our sponsors, as always. We wouldn't be able to do this without them, so a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So thank you very much for your support. Without your support, great decisions would not be happening, even in a virtual format. So just wanted to make a couple announcements. Just so that everyone knows, if you hadn't heard already, the library reopened last Wednesday. So we are now, once again, open for business. There are protocols that are in place. If you're still more comfortable with it, we're still offering curbside service. So if you're still not ready to, come back into the library, even with the protocols in place and the limited, capacity in the building, please feel free to call 920-686-3010, and you can set up curbside pickup for any materials. Pretty much everything you could do when you came into the library. The only thing is, you can't use the computers. That's about the only thing that doesn't go out the door for curbside service. Also, since you can come into the library now, you can also now pick up the companion publication for the Great Decision series, which came in at the beginning of last week. They are available for $15, cash or check. You can get them right at the front service desk. Also, you can pick them up via curbside service, just like checking out a book. You can call for that, and they will bring it out to you, and you exchange the cash and check, and you're good to go. So if you wanted to do it that way, you could call 920-686-3010 for a copy of your publication of the Great Decisions 2021 publication. Also, anything that you want to find out about Great Decisions can be located at the URL that's scrolling across the bottom of your screen right now, manitowoclibrary.org/great-decisions. You can download the pamphlet that you normally could get in the room. Also, if you're interested, contained in that pamphlet is the ability to donate via check, credit card, cash, any way you would like to the Legacy Fund for Great Decisions. Even though we love our sponsors, it would be absolutely fantastic if one day we could operate this completely on its own and with funding that we get through the Legacy Fund. So if you're interested in donating to that, please go to that URL that's scrolling across the bottom and download the donation form right now. Not right now, whenever you would like to do it, actually. Also, just want to bring up, and I'm switching the banner at the bottom, if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, just type them into the comment section, whether you're watching on Facebook or whether you're watching on YouTube. Just type them into the comments, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Speaking of presentations, and this is the last thing before I introduce Professor Klug, a couple of programs to mention. The Winter Readathon is still continuing through the 6th of March, so still time to beat the winter blahs with books. You only have to have 10 hours. You can be read to, you can read. Any way you get through those 10 hours is up to you. That's still going on through the 6th. Also, this coming Wednesday, February 24th at 7 p.m., we have Cats on Mats live time online yoga, which is going on. Now, you don't need a cat to participate, but if you do have a cat, they can wander around as you do yoga with Kate Casey. She will have her cats wandering around. And really, that is all that I have to mention as far as the announcements go. So, a brief introduction of Professor Klug. Heinz Klug is A.V. Bascom Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an honorary visiting professor at the School of Law at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. Growing up in Durban, South Africa, he participated in the anti-apartheid struggle, spent 11 years in exile, and returned to South Africa in 1990 as a member of the ANC Land Commission and researcher for the chairperson of the ANC Constitutional Committee. His research interests include constitutional transitions, constitution building, international law, and human rights. He has done research on access to medicines in the context of the global HIV/AIDS pandemic and on the World Health Organization's Access to Medicines program as part of this project. His publications include Comparative Constitutional Law, a contextual analysis with Stephen Ross and Helen Irving, LexisNexis 2014, The South African Constitution, a contextual analysis, Hart 2010, and Constituting Democracy, Law, Globalism, and South Africa's Political Reconstruction on Cambridge University Press 2000. His latest book project, a co-edited book, a research handbook on new legal realism, is due to be published next month. So that's more than enough of my talking. I would like to turn this over to Professor Klug, and he will be talking about the roles of international organizations in the global pandemic. And take it away, and I will get your PowerPoint going for you.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Welcome all to this evening's conversation. And so I will lead off with approximately 45 minutes, and then we will have a conversation, I hope, about these issues. If you go to the slide, the next slide, please. This is going to be something I'm going to have to do. The roles of international organizations in a global pandemic, that one. Great. So that was the question. This was the question that I was asked to address this evening, right? The COVID pandemic thrust the World Health Organization into the limelight, for better or for worse. And of course, there was criticism from the President Trump's administration. And today there's a lot of debate around the WHO with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. To get a grip, to answer these questions, to think about this more broadly, this evening, I want to ask address three basic issues, and as a way for us to think about this. The first is, what are international organizations and how do they make decisions? And I'll cover a couple of different ones to show you the different ways in which decisions are made and why that is important for the topic that we're going to talk about. And what is the World Health Organization and how does it function? We'll specifically focus a bit on the World Health Organization itself. And then we'll turn to how the WHO responded and how it continues to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and what has been the response and how has the world responded to that with calls for reform, etc., at the WHO. So that's the just general set of questions. And if you go to the next slide, this is the outline of tonight's talk. So the introduction is what we're doing now, and then I'm going to turn to a discussion of the post-1945 international order and how these organizations make decisions. And then, as I said, we'll turn to look at the WHO specifically, its constitution and mission, and then how it's dealt with COVID-19, and then finally, this issue of international organizations, global pandemics, and potential reform for the WHO. So the next slide, please. Okay, so here is the kind of signature signs of all these international organizations. And international organizations, there are now hundreds and thousands, they're just thousands of international organizations. The key international organization that you're all aware of is the United Nations, which has its headquarters in New York City. And the WHO, and as are most of the organizations whose symbols are before you, is a special agency of the United Nations. Now, if we think about international organizations, there are a number of international organizations prior to 1945, before the end of the Second World War, the most famous one being the League of Nations, and I'll talk about that briefly in a minute as well. But it's only after World War II that international organizations become a major feature in international relations between states. And the importance grew dramatically with decolonization, which saw the number of states in the international system expand. So today we have about 190 to 193 states in the international system. So, why that number varies depends on whether you see the Vatican as an independent state or just some kind of international organization, or for that matter, is Taiwan part of China? Is it a separate state? There are debates, but it's about 190, 193 entities that are considered part of this international system. To understand international organizations, it's important first to think about the concept of sovereignty, right? Because there's often this feeling that somehow international organizations are going to, in some way, rule over states. I think it's very important to recognize that even today, with all these international organizations, sovereignty, formal sovereignty, remains at the level of each state. And if any international organization gains power over states, in the same way that the English became very concerned that the European Union was gaining power over them, it is only because they had given, the state itself had given that power to the international organization. So states are sovereign and they hand powers to organizations to manage particular things. And so if we think about it in that way, this idea of sovereignty, which emerges from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 in Europe, is a core concept, right, in this international system. And it's based on the idea of the mutual recognition of sovereigns, the agreement not to interfere in each other's domestic affairs. Now, what happened with particularly the experience of the two world wars within a single generation, and the dramatic expansion of the destructive power of weapons, and particularly nuclear weapons, meant that it produced an understanding that despite major differences, it would be important to establish a system of international bodies, at least through which common concerns could be resolved, worked out, constantly negotiated, right? And peace and security, of course, being the central concerns post the Second World War. And if we think about the structure of the United Nations, you can only understand it if you understand that prior to the UN being formed, there was the League of Nations, which was formed after the First World War in 1920. And it was supposed to be an organization that would prevent any future wars, the idea of collective security through disarmament. What happened very early on is after it was created, in fact, President Wilson of the United States was the main motivating force for its creation, the United Nations Senate refused to sign the treaty. Right? So here's an idea that, in fact, any of these organizations are only formed because there's an agreement between states that there's a treaty. And in the US constitutional system, that means that the Senate has to agree. So the Senate did not agree, and the US thus could not join the League of Nations, did not join the League of Nations. And so the League of Nations in 1920 begins with these major powers that are not part of it, particularly the United States. The Soviet Union wasn't included because it didn't include communist nations at first. Then they allowed the Soviet Union in, but they expelled it against once the Soviet Union had invaded Finland. Well, eventually it starts to fail as it fails to address the aggression of the Axis powers, and particularly the aggression of Japan and Italy into Africa, and in the wars with Ethiopia, etc. And finally, Germany, which had originally been excluded as the defeated nation after the First World War and had been allowed to join in the mid-20s, bails out because Hitler takes power in 1933 and leaves the League of Nations. One of the problems for the League of Nations was all decisions had to be taken by unanimous vote of the 9 and then later 15 members of its council. So effectively, it couldn't make decisions when real difficulties arose around the world. And basically, although the Allied victors of the First World War were the permanent members of that council, the requirement of unanimous decision-making means that you can't get anywhere if somebody disagrees. So what happens after the Second World War when they create the United Nations? Well, the first thing is they try and address those very flaws that we'd seen in the League of Nations. So the United Nations divides between the General Assembly, the Security Council. The General Assembly is one state, one nation, one sovereign nation voting individually. And so you have General Assembly resolutions, which often here in the United States, the United States administration doesn't appreciate because they're critical of the US and of others. But it's because every member state, like in any democracy, gets to vote with single votes. But all they can do is issue declarations. Those don't have binding powers on other members. They just give, or establishing norms or trying to get people to agree. The Security Council, which is 15 members, does, however, have some kind of power. It can issue Security Council resolutions that need to be followed, or else the Security Council can impose sanctions and ultimately could, historically, even if it gets agreement under Chapter 7, intervene militarily. And so the Security Council is a very different frame. And within the Security Council, in order to deal with the problem of major global powers and to get them into around the table, they agreed to the 5 permanent members, who to this day have a veto. That too, of course, is problematic, because if the United Nations Security Council cannot agree, if one of the 5 members doesn't agree, and that is still today the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia, if one of these members disagrees, then you cannot get agreement to either impose sanctions or use force. So the UN itself is limited by the major powers. But it was the only way to get everybody and to keep everybody inside. And to this day, it has survived despite the Cold War and many other pretty intense conflicts around the world. Now, the World Health Organization is one of the major agencies that was developed out of the UN system. And so it's part of the UN system, but it is established by its own treaty, by its own agreement. But before focusing on it, I want to just move through, if we go to the next slide, and talk specifically about these organizations. But the point that I want to do, and I'm going to run through these fairly quickly, is to talk about the ways in which these different organizations function. Because understanding the different ways of functioning will help us to understand the WHO itself. So the first is the UN. It started in 1945 with 51 members. Its General Assembly is the 193 members today, and the Security Council, which I spoke about. If we think about it in terms of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, you begin to see the way in which this system kind of functions. So the General Assembly passes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But that declaration has a lot of wonderful sounding norms, and it recognizes human rights that all humans are entitled to, but there's absolutely no enforcement capacity behind it. It doesn't even purport to have the power of law. All it is a declaration. Now, there are people who argue that it's become part of customary international law, but that's a different issue altogether. There's no enforcement power that comes from that. What they try and do, what the United Nations tries to do, is to make this more enforceable by getting countries to sign treaties. And so in 1966, 2 treaties are adopted: the International Convention's covenants on political and civil rights on the one hand, and the other one on economic, social, and cultural rights. And the Convention on Political and Civil Rights, that provides within it, so here's a treaty, and a treaty is like a contract. Here, the states that sign on to it and agree to it and ratify it, which is the language of agreement. At that point, they bind themselves. That is giving that sovereignty to the organizer, to a particular agreement. And so they bind themselves to it. And if they violate it, then they are violating their obligations in international law. Of course, there's still no actual enforcement measure against them. The name of the game is to name and shame. In other words, to get the international bodies to identify a nation that is doing something in violation of its obligations, and to get public opinion against that. And that's about it. There's different levels and ways that works. Within the International Convention on Political and Civil Rights, you have the United Nations Human Rights Committee that sets up, that's people with 18 experts appointed by governments from around the world, elected. And those 18 experts serve not as representatives of countries, but as experts of human rights. And they hear complaints under the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and they write opinions. They say this country has violated its obligations in this or that way. And countries don't want to be named and shamed in this way. And that's the only force. That's the kind of moral force that the systems have. Now, the United Nations used to have a Human Rights Commission. And in 2006, that disappeared, and they created, because it was under a lot of criticism, and they created the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is also now based in Geneva, which again has 47 members of the 190 states, and they get elected on a rotating basis. What this shows you as well is basically people are elected by the groups within which they are. The UN has regional groups around the country. So Africa, Asia Pacific, European, the Americas, Latin American, Caribbean, and Western European. These are different groups. They all get to elect a certain number of people to these councils. But all decisions there, again, are voted on, but they don't have binding force. They are really kind of obligations that countries are taking on for themselves by being part of this, members of this organization. If we go to the next slide, please. The World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization was formed in 1948, a few years after the UN. It has 194 member states. And what's interesting, so the World Health Organization, as opposed to having a General Assembly and a Security Council, which the UN has, the World Health Organization has something called the World Health Assembly. And officially, according to its constitution, decisions in the World Health Assembly should be made by one state, one vote. However, what's interesting is a culture has developed in the World Health Organization with an ironclad tradition now that decisions are made by consensus. So no decisions are made by the World Health Assembly unless they can get agreement by everyone. Now, there's an executive board of the World Health Organization, which is made of 34 technical experts. Again, people who are there not as representatives of their nations, but put forward as nations, by nations to be, who are technical experts. And they set the agenda for the World Health Assembly. There's also a secretariat that runs the organization, and the Director General, now Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, is appointed on a 5-year term. He was appointed in 2017. Before him, there was the Director Generals of Margaret Chan and Gro Brundtland, and we will run into them later again. Now, the World Health Organization's constitution gives the World Health Assembly treaty-making powers. So they could all agree in the World Health Assembly to a treaty. But this, in all the years since 1948, has only been used once. And that was in 2003, when they adopted the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which was a treaty that all countries had to agree to, had to sign on to, if they wished, around tobacco control. Now, one thing about treaty powers is any country who signs a treaty can at the same time make reservations. What that means is they say, I'm part of this treaty, I agree to all of it, except for X, Y, and Z, right? For these parts of the treaty that I don't agree to be part of. Again, you see that exercise of sovereignty taking place there. And what the tobacco treaty does, it just sets minimum standards around production, sale, distribution, advertising, and taxation of tobacco internationally. But again, these are very minimal standards, and they ask states, or they encourage states, to adopt higher levels of regulation. Now, the WHO is not an implementing agency. It focuses on guidance and support. And the one thing about this culture of consensus and culture of expertise is that the World Health Organization is basically made up of doctors. So let's move on to the next slide, please. This is another organization, so I'm going to show you 4 of these. Another organization called the World Intellectual Property Organization. This was formed in 1967. It has 193 member states, and it's also one of the specialized agencies of the UN. Now, it administers 26 treaties, unlike the one that the World Health Organization has. This has 26 different treaties, international treaties on intellectual property. Again, it hosts forums, it discusses to shape intellectual property rules, policies, it provides global services that register and protect intellectual property in different countries, tries to resolve conflicts between countries around intellectual property, and it helps connect different national intellectual property systems. But the way it functions, interesting enough, it has a General Assembly and a coordinating committee, and it functions very seriously on a one-person, one-vote basis. Sorry, one state, one vote basis. It's also administered by a secretariat and headed by a director general elected by the General Assembly. Now, I tell you about the World Intellectual Property Organization because it represents in its functioning the individual opinions of states, unlike the World Health Organization, which tries to do things by consensus. So let's move along to the next slide, the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization was formed in 1994. Prior to the World Trade Organization, you had, because this was an organization that was supposed to be established as an international trade organization at the same time as the World Health Organization after the Second World War. But because of the Cold War and other disagreements with newly emerging developing states, it was never able to be established. And it was only in 1994 that it emerged. And it emerged out of what was called the Uruguay round of the GATT agreement. So when the initial conference failed to establish the International Trade Organization, they stepped back and had a set of, they had something called the different rounds of negotiation. So all the countries of the world would meet in these conferences and negotiate the tariffs on individual products. And that was a general agreement on trades and tariffs. And that existed from 1948 right through to 1982, where the Uruguay round got busy. And in that round, as the Cold War came to an end, that round decided that they were going to try and impose a global unified trade system. And so this is the only international organization where the substance of the rules of trade, of the subject matter of the organization, were baked into its original founding document. And the way they set it up was, it was a take it or leave it package. The countries had to agree to be in or out. They couldn't use the traditional international rules, which say you could reserve from X, Y, or Z and not have that apply to you. You either were in or you were out. And they also imposed a consensus-making system. So basically, the way the WTO works is by consensus only. And in this case, instead of doctors, we have trade lawyers, and trade lawyers dominate the process. But interesting enough, because the Western countries particularly, and the global intellectual property organizations weren't getting much, they weren't getting their way much in the World Intellectual Property Organization, they incorporated into the World Trade Organization something called TRIPS. Basically, this is the International Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. And TRIPS then is what makes, for instance, patents around vaccines or around medicines generally globally enforceable. And so there's been one bump in this, of course, and that was in 2001, when the developing world was facing a crisis to get medicines to deal with HIV/AIDS. And after 1996, there were antiretrovirals that made a very big difference to HIV/AIDS. And so there was an agreement called the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health in 2001 that basically allows compulsory licensing for emergency products. And of course, that's relevant today as we eventually start talking about the vaccine. So let's turn now to the WHO itself. So the next slide, please. And we can, so I've already talked about the WHO to a certain extent, and I want to talk now about its mission and how it was. So it was created, as I said, in 1948. Article 1 of the Constitution states that the organization's objective, and go on to the next slide, please, that the organization's objective is the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. So that's the basic mission of the World Health Organization. And it sees within this mission 4 roles for itself. And this is a photo of the entrance of its headquarters in Geneva, where many of these organizations are based. And so what it does, these 4 roles it sees, is to be a global hub of scientific and technical expertise related to health, collecting and analyzing information, issuing guidelines, establishing model programs, regulating the quality of medicines. And the way it does that is it does its own scientific research, but then offers that to countries around the world. It isn't as I said before, it is not an implementing agency. It also strives to be a normative agency, setting goals and agendas for improving health, advocating for universal health care as a human right. Third, to be a chief convening and coordinating authority in global health matters. And fourth, to serve as a political venue for states to advance their interests. In other words, the realm of soft power. Now, apart from the treaty power, which I mentioned, which they have only ever used once, the WHO Constitution also provides for the adoption of international health regulations by the World Health Assembly. The earliest versions of these was adopted in 1951, called the International Sanitary Regulations. And the International Health Regulations themselves were first adopted in 1969 and were revised again in 2007. And we'll run into that when we start talking about the pandemics themselves. So in terms of the organization, if we move to the next slide, here's a slide that shows you at that time the Director General Margaret Chan at the WHO with her leadership team, and of course it's a familiar debate, as I say. It's public health or sovereignty, because the question is what can the WHO actually do if there is a global health emergency, if something like one of these pandemics breaks out? And so that's the real question. If you go to the next slide, here you see the WHO headquarters in Geneva. What's interesting, of course, is their budget is no bigger than a large hospital in the United States, large public hospital in the United States. So there's real limits just at that level. But as you've seen already, the limits are also in the very power that they possibly can exercise. As I said, we've already spoken a bit about the organizational structure. If you go to the next slide, there's a meeting of the World Health Assembly, where delegates of the 193 countries are meeting to try and reach decisions. If you go to the next slide, there was a decision in November this last year, which was you see that one of the Dr. Melisela here been very excited because she's a director of one of the sections in the World Health Organization, because the World Health Assembly decided to set new targets for neglected tropical diseases. But this is the kind of way in which it's done. They set targets, they adopt a new roadmap, they try and push countries to move. They're not an implementing agency. They can't do anything themselves. The next slide, please. Here's the executive meeting at the World Health Organization. Next slide, please. And this is the Director General, the present Director General, which I already mentioned, of the World Health Organization. So you had the World Health Assembly, you had the Secretariat, the Executive and the Secretariat. And here, if you move to the next slide, here you see the the Director General with two of his senior members of the staff, the executive. And the one thing you'll notice if you look closely, of course, it's Dr. Ryan. The Director General is also doctor, and Dr. Kirkhover, von Kirkhover. They're all doctors. And that's a large part of what the WHO is about. As compared to other international organizations, these operate in what I call a medical model. In other words, these are doctors who like to show by example how things should happen. They present evidence, they offer guidelines, and they expect the national states to pick it up. And in fact, the way the whole structure is organized is that it has the 6 regions, and within those 6 regions, it has 150 offices in states around the world. But all of those offices work with the national health authorities of particular countries. So anything that actually happens because the national health authorities actually do it. They take the advice of the WHO office, or they take advice from something that comes from Geneva. And we'll see that in a moment as well. So if we look at if we go to the next slide, please. Of course, the World Health Organization and national organizations are also constantly under pressure from populations, from organizations, etc. Who, what was interesting here, they talk about their own People's Health Assembly. So there's pressures to try and actually advance the goals of health as an international human right. Next panel, please. So here, let's talk. I want to turn to talking about how the WHO actually responded to COVID-19. And to do that, we need to briefly talk about the ways in which, about the series of pandemics. So if you think about the WHO as an agency that offers a model to the world, that tries to do that. And one of its first large events back in 1978 was a declaration called the Alma Ata Declaration, which was adopted by the International Conference on Primary Healthcare. So in 1978, the WHO's whole orientation was primary healthcare. Tertiary healthcare was too expensive for most nations around the world, very limited. So the best way to improve health for all was through primary care. That was the goal. But primary care, of course, doesn't deal very well when we're dealing with pandemics, when we're dealing with particularly global pandemics. Now, the international health regulations that were adopted in 1969 required countries only to report outbreaks of 3 diseases: cholera, plague, and yellow fever. So that was the only authority, that was the only requirement that was imposed on member states by the WHO. So by their own agreement, of course, as I say, that granting of sovereignty, that giving of something to the organization so that it can function. And so the agreement was that if any of those 3 diseases broke out in a country, they would report it. And the international health regulations specifically only allowed the WHO to notify the world, to notify the public about an outbreak if it was based on information formally reported to it by a member state. So again, you see the sovereigns holding back a bit. They want that authority, that power for themselves to decide whether, in fact, they are going to release information from within their own countries. So in 2003, we have the SARS epidemic, and that brings pressure to change because this epidemic goes around the world, and the WHO, at first, in its attempts to respond to it, it breaks out initially in China, and Gro Brundtland, who was then the Director General, put a lot of pressure on China at the time to produce information. And of course, at the time, the question was whether she could tell the world. And China was not, back in 2003, nearly in as strong a position as it is in the world today. And so they, under pressure, provided the information. In 2009, the next pandemic sweeps the world, and that's the swine flu pandemic, H1N1. And what was interesting in that particular case, after 2003, after the SARS pandemic, in 2005, the WHO started redoing the international health regulations. And here they introduced, in 2007, a new mechanism where basically if there was a committee that was established under the Secretariat that could meet and decide that in fact there was what was called a public health emergency of international concern. And if they found that, they then could declare it to the world and to other countries. And so that was resulted from that initial SARS pandemic. So when swine flu comes along in 2009, there's more cooperation from China, and it leads to the first declaration of a PHEIC, this public health emergency of international concern. There are a number of these emergencies that happened after 2009. So there's the West African Ebola virus epidemic, 2013 to 2016. And in that case, Margaret Chan, then Director General, delayed the declaration because she was under pressure from the countries of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Why delay it? Why do these countries want it delayed? Well, it has an immediate impact. Their borders often get closed, or tourists stop coming, other countries start restricting flights, etc. So countries are very reluctant to go down that road, to allow it to happen. In polio in 2014 was declared an epidemic, the Zika virus epidemic 2015-2016, the Kivu Ebola epidemic in 2018-19, and now the COVID-19 epidemic, which is declared in 2019 and ongoing. So how did this, if we just focus briefly on the actual COVID-19 pandemic. So if you go to the next slide, please. So there's the photos, the great photos that we've got used to of looking at this, this horrendous virus that is hurting us so deeply. If you go to the next one. Okay, so let me just run down very quickly the initial response to the COVID-19. So what happens in December 13, 2019, the WHO picked up reports of a viral pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan, China. So they various agencies, and they pick up this report, and they ask China, they ask the government of China for more information. And in Geneva, they activate an emergency response team to get ready to start trying to deal with this new, what they are worrying is going to be a new pandemic. So on January 3rd, so not that long after, China does officially notify the WHO that there is something going on. They do respond. On January 9th, the WHO reports that Chinese scientists have identified a new novel coronavirus, COVID-19. So this is only 9 days after they get their initial report that there's something going on. On January 10th, the WHO issues its first set of technical guidance. So it's trying to work out what's going on here. Is this like SARS? What's happening? And on January 12th, 2 days later, China actually shares a copy of the virus genome with the World Health Organization, but at the same time that they publish it internationally. Now, this, of course, raises some concerns for the WHO because they realize that this genome probably was being worked on for a little longer than since December 31st. So they are suspicious that the Chinese were aware that something was going on earlier than what they've said, but they want to continue to get cooperation out of China because as they work with any of their member states, they need cooperation. They don't have the power to actually do something. So after it gets shared, the WHO technical team lead raises the prospect of human-to-human transmission. And what's interesting is when they do that on January 14th, so they say, look, we are concerned that there could be human-to-human transmission of this virus. And China says, look, you have no clear evidence of that yet. You can't show any evidence of that. Whether they have it or not, we don't know at this point. But the point is the Chinese tell the WHO, you have no evidence. That forces the WHO to retract its statement that this virus is possibly going to do human-to-human transmission. So this is the first black eye that the WHO suffers in this particular process. A few days later, however, January 19th, 20th, China confirms that in fact there is human transmission of COVID. January 22nd, the Director General of the WHO now convenes a meeting of the emergency body to start to decide whether they can agree to declare a public health emergency of international concern. And again, there's pressure from within and saying we don't know enough, we can't be sure, although now we're starting to see cases emerge in other countries. And it's only on January 30th, right? So nearly 8 days later, that they actually declare a international pandemic. Now, what does the WHO do following that? Now it's declared this international pandemic. Well, it very effectively does track the global numbers. So you can go onto the WHO website and you can see really good information in terms of those numbers. They combat misinformation to the extent that they can. They offer public health information, and I'll show you some of that stuff in a moment. They are also trying to coordinate the vaccine effort in terms of they've created something called COVAX together with others, and that coordination role, they would serve as the clearinghouse for a large amount of the international vaccine effort. But again, at first it was assumed that this clearinghouse would be the source of all vaccines. All vaccines would come there and be distributed internationally through the clearinghouse. But in fact, the more wealthy countries, including the US, but Europe as well, have made direct agreements with the vaccine makers to try and get access quicker and more access, which of course is raising issues about the WHO's ability to actually manage this on one hand. On the other hand, large equity issues for countries further down that even today are not yet receiving access to the vaccine. So let's just look briefly at the kind of missteps that the WHO has engaged in. And if you look at the slide before you, that talks about this question between droplets and airborne. And we know that was a debate that went on here in the country as well. And but as I told you already, when that was first announced by the WHO, they had raised the issue of possible human-to-human transmission. And China had said no, and they'd backed off. But they had similar difficulties later on, not with China, but just with the science. They had conflicting messages about asymptomatic transmission. And this was a difference between the technical meaning and a colloquial meaning. There were criticisms that they were too slow to respond to new scientific developments, and the one being this transmission of small aerosolized particles versus large respiratory droplets. So again, it's one thing when they said, long as you stayed far enough away from somebody because you didn't want to catch the droplets when they coughed, etc., and you washed your hands and cleared, that would be adequate. And then it became clear that, in fact, some of this virus was aerosolized and able to move across much larger distances. And that required the wearing of masks by everybody. But again, they were relatively slow to advise the public to wear masks. Now, whether that was because they were concerned about the shortage of masks in the world, the shortage particularly of masks for health workers. So you can see reasons, but the result is that they are seen to make missteps. And countries very quickly can turn on that and say, well, you're to blame, not us. So if you go to the next screen, that's the masks picture. And the next one is testing. If we go to testing, and as you know, around the world, everybody's trying PPE shortages at first, and eventually testing, still difficulties with testing and tracing right across the globe, some doing a little better than others. And go to the next slide, please. And this is one of the most effective things that the WHO can do. It offers real-time training in national languages through simulation exercises, etc. This is what doctors do, and this is what the WHO can do. It can help train other people to try and deal with something like COVID-19. It can't do anything itself. As I say, it has the budget of a small hospital. and yet it has to be responsible for global health. If we go to the next slide, please. So the public health approach that they adopt, of course, is to put out information. Now, I'm going to run you through this whole set of slides in like 3 seconds now. But basically, they're trying to combat false information. They're trying to pass on information. They do it through the web. They do it through these posters. And if you go down through the set quite quickly, you just see these various kinds of posters trying to deal with both, trying to put out facts, trying to deal with rumors, trying to deal with false information. If you keep on going through, please. Another one here around, whether drinking methanol or ethanol or bleach will help, what consequences of alcohol, questions of temperature, keep on going. And then whether if you're wearing masks and exercising, etc. But these are all, and keep on going to the next one and the one after. And this one, if you look at the bottom right-hand one, it says, this is just another one of these many. It says, does the new virus affect older people or younger people also susceptible? So again, it's just public health information. But yeah, I have an example in the next slide, if we go down to the next one, of how this is actually used. Now, we don't see this much in the United States because we have our own information systems, but here you see a WHO slide on the left. And then on the right, you see the exact same slide now picked up in South Africa by the South African Department of Health and used in public health. And that's how they've been used all around the world. So that's the kind of public health messaging that the WHO can do. But again, it's not much, right? It's a lot in one way, but not much in terms of actually trying to help people in terms of health. Okay, let's go to the next one. Of course, this would make a difference, and that's the global coordination of COVAX and vaccine safety. And so they gather information on vaccine safety, they do their own tests, and particularly if you think of countries that don't have the capacity, like the United States or Europe or China has, to actually evaluate medicines, evaluate the safety of vaccines. This gets coordinated through the WHO, and that is a great benefit to countries around the world. If we go to the next slide, please. So what about this issue of reform? Well, as you know, there was this initial concern about whether China was revealing information and revealing it quick enough. And its obligations as a member of the WHO, of course, is to provide that information. So when these suspicions arose, various other countries objected. And so here you see a situation where in the World Health Assembly, they've asked for a probe of the WHO's response. Right? They can't ask for a probe of China's response, but they can ask for a probe of what the WHO knew, when it knew it, what did it know, what did its scientists know. And so 58 nations join India in demanding an evaluation of the WHO response to the novel coronavirus pandemic. Next slide, please. And here, of course, just this last February, just earlier this month, we have a photo of WHO officials visiting Wuhan and that Institute of Virology that it was, some people were trying to claim may have been a source of the virus. And their investigation, they've gone back to Geneva now, and one or two of them have complained that although the Chinese government was fairly forthcoming, gave them a lot of information that enabled them to say that this virus probably did not come from these sources, but they also wanted to get the original samples of the first people the first people who got COVID, and then they'd be able to, of course, work out when this was first arising, and that the Chinese government still is keeping for itself and not sharing with the WHO. And the WHO has absolutely no either authority or capacity to actually demand something. All they can do is request. So in this country, the Trump administration expresses, if you go to the next slide. So in this country, the Trump administration expressed great frustration with what was going on, and they announced their withdrawal from the WHO. And now this was part of a broader pattern of the Trump administration trying to withdraw from international organizations. I never quite understood that because the US has enormous influence in these organizations, and just to get out of them doesn't do anything for the US. It doesn't preserve its sovereignty. It has its sovereignty already. But they decided to do that in July 2020. The response by then candidate Biden was that Americans are safer when America's engaged in strengthening global health. And he announces that on his first day as president, he will rejoin the WHO and restore our leadership on the world stage. And that he says on exactly the same day. Of course, what we know is January 21st, shortly after returning of being elected president of the United States and being sworn in, President Biden, in fact, rejoined the WHO. So the US is now, again, a member. Never actually left, because in order to leave any of these international organizations, you have to give at least 6 months notice, and sometimes even longer. And so we had entered that notice period, but before we ended that period, we had already rejoined. So if you look at the next slide, please. And we're coming to the end quite soon. Sorry, next slide. And next one. Thank you. So if we look at it in terms of the funding that the US provides, the US is a very important part of the World Health Organization simply because of its level of funding. But if you look at this funding, what you see in the blue column, the blue part of the column as compared to the dark blue, the light blue part, is what's called voluntary funding. So the stable amount at the bottom goes from 107 million to 119 million in 2019 is what's called the annual dues, if you like, that the country pays to be a member of the WHO. But what the US does is it actually adds a great deal more. So in 2019, it gives a total of $419 million to the WHO, and only 119 of that is its actual membership fee, if you like. The rest is what's assessed. The rest is a voluntary contribution. This is classical soft power, right? So that in fact, a lot of what goes on in the WHO, they are very, very concerned about what the US would think, simply because this is a major portion of the funding of the WHO. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so if we think about WHO reform, let's be very clear on some of the details. That with a budget of 2.4 billion, which is the same as a large hospital in the United States, it only controls itself 30% of that budget, because 80% of it is these non-flexible voluntary contributions. So when the US contributes that extra money, it also says what it should be used for. It doesn't just hand them the cash. And 65% of funds come from just 15 donors, of which the US is the largest. So an enormous amount of the budget of the organization actually is fairly controlled. And the member state assessment contributions have long been frozen. So member states, and some fail to pay, and then they get pushed out, and then they pay and they come back. Now, the Public Health Emergency of International Concern Declaration is also a source of criticism because it's an on-off switch. In other words, either we have an international emergency or we don't. And one of the concerns is we don't want to declare something that's an international emergency if it's not that serious. And that's what happened at one point with H1N1, where the impact was never that great. And so there was a lot of criticism of the WHO at that point for declaring an international emergency. And so could there be a system that goes somewhere in between where we could say there's something coming, be prepared, it could be bad before declaring a full emergency. There's, of course, also the lack of political independence from its membership as an organization. Serious criticisms relate to the questions of transparency and oversight of the organization itself. But it's quite clear it is essential for global health. And so the question one could ask is, what powers should the WHO in fact have? Now, there has been a call in that regard, in this context. So in November, the European Council President, Charles Michel, first proposed a new international treaty under the WHO, and calling it the idea of a pandemic treaty. So a pandemic treaty would then have countries binding themselves to particular behaviors if a pandemic were to break out. And so on the 15th of this month, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom said he would support a global treaty on pandemics that would establish standards for data sharing and transparency. So still not going very far. No standards for vaccines, no standards for requiring different kinds of action, but just actual requirements for data sharing and transparency, because those aren't even the obligations of countries today. So when we say that China has not moved very quickly, it hasn't actually violated any of its actual obligations. It did eventually inform the WHO, and as I said, in fairly quick order. It maybe is not as transparent as we would wish, but it's not required to be. It's still a sovereign nation. So that tension between sovereignty and what these international organizations can do, even in the face of a pandemic, is a serious difficulty that we still haven't. The structure of the international system and of international organizations still is not actually managing very well. So I'll end there and open up for questions. Oh, so the last slide is a slide that I just hope will make everybody feel a little better at this time. And this is the daily COVID-19 vaccine doses administered per 100 people in countries around the world. And as you can see, it is picking up. But the sad thing is, if you go below to Mexico and below all the other countries, they're still not actually getting the vaccine into people's arms. These other countries are starting to make progress. But hopefully this is just the beginning of a year where we will see this expand and everybody will, in fact, in the end, have a vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Klug. Before we move on to the questions, I wanted to ask you, is it okay if someone requests a copy of your PowerPoint? Is it okay if I share it out with people?
Sure. I mean, there's nothing there that's controversial. From me, I say it. I'm happy to say it publicly.
All right. So if anyone would like a copy of this to be emailed to them, scrolling along the bottom of your screen right now is my email address at the library. Just email me a request, and I will get you Professor Klug's PowerPoint as quickly as I can. So that's enough of seeing my name scroll across there. Just a few things before we move on to the questions. Just really just one thing. There is a lot of information here, and things like the pandemic and the World Health Organization generate a lot of different feelings in a lot of different people. So please just remember to be respectful with your questions, especially be respectful to Professor Klug, and be respectful. All right. I don't know if you wanted to say that just so blatantly out front, but that's okay. But give a stern attempt to be respectful of each other, and let's get to the questions then. I had one come in right at the beginning, and I think perhaps you may have answered this person's question, but the former administration had necessary protocols to make regarding the World Health Organization. Where do you have any concerns about the current administration's decisions on, how they've re-entered it, or anything about the protocols of the current administration?
Well, the current administration has just gone back to where the US was before, right? It's just returned the US to the World Health Organization with all the limitations of that, right? So it does increase the influence of the United States, there's no question, because it's back at the table. I'm sure there'll still be a lot of grumbling within the fact that the US was prepared to just step out. But the fact is that it's back at the table, and it is still the largest donor to the World Health Organization. And so nothing has changed. So this pattern of being a member of the WHO, the US has been a member since 1948. The US has also been a large funder for a long, long time. And the US as such has had an enormous amount of influence on how the WHO functions. So for instance, in the access to medicine realm, what happened was there was a period in the 1990s when the US wasn't particularly happy with the fact that this medicines program was issuing lists of essential medicines that was preferencing generic medicines more than anything else. The pharmaceutical companies put a lot of pressure on the US government to try and get involved in the WHO. And the US, through its influence, because it was the largest funder, persuaded the World Health Organization to allow the pharmaceutical companies who have a direct interest to be at the table at the World Health Organization for debates about essential medicines. And effectively, they managed to slow down the process that the World Health Organization was engaged in to try and encourage access to essential medicines. So, it's been in the interest of private interests as well as public interests in the US, that this engagement with the World Health Organization. So, whether I'm critical of it or think it's okay, the fact is we've gone back to where we were before the Trump administration just withdrew. What I don't understand is what we thought we were going to get out of just withdrawing.
Fair enough. This next question and comment is long. I would normally post it on the screen for you, but it wouldn't fit on the screen. I found this out last couple of weeks with longer things.
Right ahead.
So here we go. A cursory attempt to familiarize oneself with all the work the World Health Organization accomplishes throughout the world on a shoestring budget makes it abundantly apparent that humanity simply cannot do without one coordinated effort to protect our individual health in an increasingly global world. Can you speak to how vital it is for the U.S. government to deprogram the portion of its citizenry that were in part misled by the past administration into believing that the U.S. support and cooperation with the World Health Organization is anything but absolutely necessary? You did kind of address that in your last question. I ask because it seems some people think the value of the World Health Organization is merely for less prosperous and less powerful countries.
Well, I think one thing's very clear, right, is that even though the World Health Organization, as I said, on this shoestring budget, does do an enormous amount of work around the world through this modeling, through showing by examples, trying to set up protocols for countries. And so people do think this is a great benefit for poorer countries, which hopefully it is. But there's also an enormous benefit for the United States. This is a global surveillance system that tries to pick up where diseases are breaking out. Now, as I say, there was a period of time when I suppose we could think that we were on top of this. Yellow fever, cholera, these weren't the plague, these weren't things that were of great concern to the US. It had been overcome. And even malaria and many of these other diseases, the US had managed to deal with. And so these were other people's problems. These new viruses that have been coming out, building out, that's why I ran through all of them from SARS to the present. They've been coming quicker and more often, and now with COVID, a lot more deadly than the previous ones. And without knowing what's happening out there, we're going to be caught short-handed, which in fact we were in this particular case, right? We didn't know what was happening quick enough. Now, here's the part that's really problematic. China had in fact said there's this deadly disease coming around by early January. And we didn't do much. We didn't take it seriously enough. That's on us. That's not on the WHO. The WHO was already saying this is a problem. Now, we could argue that there were missteps. They didn't recognize quick enough about aerosol dispersal, but neither did our scientists. We had exactly the same, if you like, debates domestically, right? We were arguing on the stage in front of everybody between the president and Dr. Fauci, whether we had to worry about masks, whether we had to worry about transmission, whether we could open up certain things at certain times. So I don't think the WHO carries that much blame for that part of things. They don't help us as directly in terms of the kind of advertising that I showed you, etc., because the US has the capacity to do that stuff itself. But where the US really does benefit dramatically is the fact that we are in a global world. People move all the time, including US citizens, which we can't keep out, and we don't want to. And as a result, the sooner we know what's going on, I mean, the Zika one was classic, right? Zika breaks out in Brazil. And the fact is, we were able to address it fairly quickly because we learned what was going on. We could get people down there. And if we didn't have the WHO coordinating that type of thing, and even just creating a system where all other countries, all other sovereigns can also feel that they can benefit from the sharing of information, we don't want them sitting on information like that and not telling us, right? That would be the worst possible outcome. So yes, I think the WHO and many of these international organizations, in fact, are really important parts of how we live in the world together. And we think that we can go it alone. I think COVID has made it very clear to us that going it alone, as rich and powerful as the United States is not really an option.
Question from Michael Wellner. Once clear COVID transmission, once it became apparent that COVID transmission was respiratory and that masks could inhibit it, could the World Health Organization have more rapidly published a best practices guide encouraging first mask wearing, and second, what the most effective mask types would be?
I suppose they could have. I think they were caught in the same tension that was here in the US, in the sense that they knew there was an international shortage of the kind of masks that really were necessary. And there was a tendency not to push it very hard at first, because the hope was that these masks would get to emergency personnel, particularly health workers. And I think that, and again, they're a bunch of doctors. And so there's this little bit of self-interest there, but I don't think it's self-interest. I think we all understand why health workers had to be protected first, just like we're doing with the vaccines now, because it's the health workers that have to deal with the rest of us when we get sick. So they have, in fact, been quite prolific recently in sending out that information about mask wearing, etc. They maybe didn't get to it as quick as they could. What is really hard is how many people and misinformation, etc., leads so many people in the world not to think that that is the way to go, to somehow see this as an imposition from their own state or from the WHO or anybody else, when it really, if we were all wearing masks whenever we were anywhere out in public, we would have an 80% cut just like that. And the fact that we're not doing that is on us, every one of us.
Our speaker for next week actually has a question for you. Could you please elaborate on what you said at the beginning about sovereignty? Namely, does joining any international organization mean losing sovereignty?
Well, let's be very clear about that. It doesn't mean losing sovereignty. To the degree that any country loses sovereignty, it's the fact that power in the world, whether it's through big multinational corporations or whatever, sometimes gets beyond the capacity of a state to actually address. But that's not because it's joined any organization. What I was saying in the beginning was, if you think about the rules that an international organization makes, even if they are rules that countries feel they need to follow, they are only made because the country has given permission for those rules to be made, for at least for the process. Now, maybe they disagree on the individual rule, but they've already agreed to be bound by the rules in that particular context. They've given their permission, whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's the WHO, etc. Right? So, but we know that the way international law works, even when a country agrees, so the US agrees to the international health regulations, but at the same time, they put in reservations. For instance, they say we're a federal system and therefore the federal government can't be expected to impose things, say like masks, on the states, right? So that is a limit imposed by US sovereignty on the international organization. But at all moments, as we saw, the Trump administration says, we're withdrawing, we're leaving. So they haven't given up any sovereignty. they can just walk away. They have all the sovereignty they ever had. It doesn't actually, though, do them any good. Right. So yes, there's lots of intellectual and academic debates about how sovereignty is distributed around the world or dissipating or whatever. But if you look at it carefully, what you see in these international regulatory kind of frameworks is that the individual states are only in their own interests giving some sovereignty to the organization, giving some power to the organization so it can function. That is not really giving up sovereignty, because in the end of the day, they can walk away. Now, we do have this myth that all sovereigns are equal. But it's quite clear that a small, developing, poor country doesn't really have exactly the equal power as, say, the United States when we're talking about sovereignty. But in the international system, we like, particularly in these consensus contexts, to assume that all parties are equal based on kind of equal respect. We know that is not what actually happens in the real world. But for a country with the power and predominance in the US, in the international system like the US, to be concerned about losing sovereignty is not very realistic, to be honest.
Next, we have a statement, and I'd like to hear your comment on it. Given its meager budget and lack of enforcement teeth, the greatest opportunity for the World Health Organization seems to be directly educating and informing the global public. Is that an accurate assessment?
I mean, that's basically what I've been arguing, that is what they do. I'm not arguing that's what that was the best they could do, but that is what they actually do. But again, they have a limit, right? They can't just go over the heads of nation states and doing that education. But first of all, they don't have the capacity. They don't have their own, global news network to do it on. But they can call news conferences. They can make statements. But we know how difficult that is for them. So in this COVID context, they come out very quickly and they say, we have to be concerned about human-to-human transmission. And a member state, China, turns around to them and says, you don't have the evidence of that yet. And it's true. They hadn't been given the evidence of that. And so they had to withdraw their statement, because they didn't want to be caught making a false statement. And so this power that the states have now, there is the attempts to give more power, to say have a treaty where they would be given the right to use any information that they gather to put out to the world without having to get the permission from the state from which it's coming. Right? That would be upping it. And that's what they do. Once they declare an international emergency, of a public health emergency of international concern, at that moment, they get the authority to actually make these statements without going back and asking the nation state. Right? So that's the steps in order to do that. But yes, I think their most effective way of being in the world seems to be to do direct education and information distribution. They're most effective, in fact, at training people at the local levels, at providing levels of scientific and other information that individual nations may not have the capacity to get themselves and to share it with them. That's their most powerful effect that they actually have in the world.
Mark Maurer had a very interesting question. In regard to everything we've been talking about, actually, about the sovereignty and our demi-withdrawal, what is the history of other countries leaving the World Health Organization, and under what circumstances did they leave, if they in fact did leave?
I'm not aware of any other country having left the World Health Organization. It hasn't historically been a center of controversy, right? I mean, the tensions with China and that didn't have China leaving. So I'd be interested to know if Mark or anybody else knows of a country that actually left the World Health Organization.
But to your knowledge, the U.S. is the only one that started the process.
But didn't, yes.
But eventually didn't. Okay. So if anyone does know of another country that did leave the World Health Organization,
I'd be really interested.
Yeah. And even if it isn't tonight, please get in touch with me and I will pass the information on if you do have that. Since you are interested, I will get it back to you. That is the last question we have currently. We do still have a little bit of time if anyone has any other questions. I think it's been a very good discussion so far. And if you'd anything else that you would like to get in last minute, The person who asked the question does not personally know of anyone, any other country.
Okay. I'd be fascinated. I've not seen anything, but it's possible. We should Google it quickly. Somebody should just Google it. Let's see if I can Google it. We can maybe find out.
While the Googling is going on, just wanted to mention that next week, our topic will be China's role in Africa. And the person who is presenting that is actually Martin Farrell, Dr. Martin Farrell, who has actually given a lecture at all 14 of the Great Decision years at Manitowoc Public Library. So he is returning next week, and he was watching along tonight with the question about sovereignty, and he will be discussing China's role in Africa.
Yeah, nothing comes up when you ask Google whether any countries have left the WHO. There's, what comes up, of course, is withdrawal from the European Union, which is Brexit. That's an example of withdrawal right now. It's not sure how well that's going to work out either. What's interesting, there's so little demand on countries to be part of these organizations, whether it's the UN or anything else. There doesn't seem any reason why a nation would withdraw. This was just symbolic politics in the United States about trying to send a message that of a particular kind of politics in relation to the world that had nothing to do with the actual World Health Organization or anything it may have done. That's not to say any organization's perfect, right? I mean, nobody's claiming that. But in fact, I can't see anything that was egregious enough to warrant that.
The lack of perfection actually leads nicely into a question that just came through. Mm-hmm. And this is a bit more of a fun question with a bit of role playing involved for you. If you were king of the world with authority, well, if you want to take a breath and assume this position of being king of the world, with authority over the World Health Organization, what would you change about that organization?
Well, what one would want to do is to persuade countries around the world to actually give a little more power to the organization, to allow it to be able to intervene more directly or control some resources to a greater degree. I think what I would do is, for the World Health Organization, I want to increase its budget and actually have more scientists and more people actually doing the work that it's doing. That's what I would like to see, because I do think among many of these international organizations, this is one of the most effective, right, in terms of the work that it actually does, the health work it does around the world. I mean, it's been very active in the vaccination campaigns against many other diseases, and that's really important. Now, it works through national health agencies, and when national health agencies are in trouble, then the World Health Organization can't be that effective. Unfortunately, the period since the 1990s with the defunding of many national health programs or organizations, government organization, public health, means that in fact that's limited its reach as well.
So when you become king of the world,
yeah, right,
you would use that influence to convince other people to give the World Health Organization more authority, not so much.
So the difficulty I have with being king of the world is I don't think the world works very well with a king. I think the only way you get people to do things is when they agree to do things. So you need to educate them and give them the democratic rights to choose what they wish to do. Then we stand a chance of getting something done. So that's why I'm rather reluctant to assume that role of king, because I really don't think it works.
Well, since Professor Klug has turned down the kingship of the world, it was still a very good answer regardless. If anyone has any more questions, we have about 5 minutes left for taking questions. If no one has any more questions or comments, I think, thank you for your questions and comments thus far. It's been a very good evening, a very good discussion. As always, these topics are very interesting. And just quick comment. Thank you. Great talk. And I think that sums it up pretty well. And I think, maybe we'll just take that as the last comment, because it was a very good talk, packed with information. If you want the PowerPoint, we've had a couple of requests come through for it already.
The best thing about the PowerPoint is all those WHO informationals about COVID. They're actually really good.
Well, if anyone would just like to see the posters, if for that, just send me an email. I'll put my email address. We had another quick comment from Laura Conklin. Thank you, Dr. Klug, and on Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin, absolutely.
It's my alma mater also. So I will flash my email address one last time. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, just send that off to me at the address scrolling, tkaczynski@manitowoc.org, and I will get that for you in the very near future, by tomorrow for sure. So thank you very much, Dr. Klug, for being here this evening. Thank you, everyone who watched. Thank you, everyone who had questions or comments. It was another great evening of great decisions with Manitowoc Public Library.
The only thing I would say at the end now, and it's very sad, is that there's just been a report issued that unfortunately we as a country have reached the shocking milestone of 500,000 casualties from COVID. And that is really, really sad. So let's hope everybody stays well and healthy. That's what we can hope. And get vaccinated.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Nothing more to add. That is the perfect ending. Have a great night, everyone. See you next week. Thank you, Professor Klug.
Thank you.